On this episode of Newt's World, when the Biden administration took office in January 2021, Eric Schmitt had been Attorney General for the state of Missouri for 2 years and had been focused on tackling violent crime. As soon as he began to see the outrageous excesses of the Biden administration, he and his team snapped into action, waging war on the Biden regime's stunning attempts at government overreach, winning some of the most important fights in modern American history, and helping set the stage for a return to common sense in government. Now, in his new book, The Last Line of Defense, Senator Schmitt takes us behind the scenes of those battles for the first time and describes how conservatives can keep winning in court and beyond. Some of his biggest court battles were against mask mandates, student debt forgiveness, restrictions on Second Amendment rights, woke ideology in our schools, open borders, attacks on free speech, and the weaponization of government agencies. I am really pleased to welcome my guest, Senator Eric Schmitt. He is a sixth-generation Missourian, currently represents the people of Missouri in the United States Senate, and he previously served as his state's Attorney General. Eric, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Newt, it is great to be back with you. I was on 4 years ago when we sued China, and a lot has happened in those 4 years, so it's great to be back with you.
I was going to say, it's hard to believe how much has gone on in the last 4 years, isn't it?
Yes, the world's turned over a few times.
Before we start discussing your book, I understand you just recently announced a historic FBI investment to combat violent crime in St. Louis. Tell us about how that partnership came together.
Yeah, so this administration from the get-go was very open about their desire to help crime-plagued cities deal with those challenges. And so during the confirmation process and talking to Pam Bondi and talking to Kash Patel specifically, we kind of hatched this plan as Kash was saying, hey, look, I want to get FBI agents out of Washington and into the field. And I said, well, I've got just the place for you. And so we've been working on this for a while, and it represents the largest infusion per capita of any place in the country of permanent FBI agents to take on violent crime. So these are not going to be paper pushers. These are people that are specifically dedicated to taking on the worst of the worst, because what we're seeing happen in Washington, D.C., in a different context, of course, a little bit because of Washington, D.C. versus St. Louis in the state, is that there's just no substitute, Newt, for a law enforcement presence. There just isn't, and prosecutions that follow. And so that's what we want to see, and their willingness to do it. I think this will end up being a model for other places. So you'll have the permanent presence of more FBI agents to take on violent crime, and then also we'll be working towards multilateral efforts with other agencies like the DEA, ATF, ICE, others, to kind of surge in St. Louis and other places to get the worst of the worst off the streets.
What do you expect in terms of the actual number of agents?
We're kind of keeping that number a little bit on the down low, I guess, so to speak, but it's not a small number. And what we really want is, again, because we talked about it. I mean, you've seen FBI agents go to particular places. Maybe it's an anti-terrorism kind of thing, and all those things are important. But when you're dealing with cities like Chicago or St. Louis or any major metro area right now, or the urban core, what they really need are people who are willing to go in and arrest the bad guys and chase them and find them and go get them and put them in jail.
Why do you think the local police just literally can't cope with it?
Well, there's a lot of reasons. These guys are heroes, as you know, Newt. But something happened on the way to where we're at now, which is during that whole defund the police movement. Ironically, that kind of began in Ferguson 10 years ago in the St. Louis area when you saw that nonsense happen. And that was really the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is this neo-Marxist group that's really been exposed. But then, of course, in the summer of 2020, with those riots, really you saw a lot of law enforcement professionals early retirement. Somebody asked me when I was Attorney General, what keeps you up at night? And there were a few things, but one of the things that was more prominent was that just all the people that will never go into law enforcement, right? Because of the disrespect they were shown. So their budgets were slashed. They were being spit on. Morale was really low. We're starting to see an uptick, I think, in that now, which is good. So the numbers have been depleted. They were not able to do their jobs. Newt, in places like St. Louis, we don't have her anymore, but Kim Gardner was a Soros-funded prosecutor that was much more likely to go after cops in many instances than criminals. We had the McCloskey incident where she went after people defending their homes as opposed to the rioters. So you had this environment where they were out doing their jobs in some of the roughest neighborhoods, but then the prosecutor wouldn't actually charge on the crime. Now, one of the things I did was, as AG, we partnered with the U.S. Attorney's Office to get around that to some degree, to go after carjackings and unlawful possession of firearms and a federal court system. But now that she's gone, it sort of opens up, I think, more opportunities. So these partnerships with the federal agents and locals will be working side by side is really what this is about. So it's increased capacity while they grow their numbers locally, but you got to have some leadership as far as them being deployed and letting them do their jobs. And I think that's the lesson.
Well, I mean, it is amazing whether it's St. Louis or New Orleans or Baltimore or Chicago or Washington, D.C., the degree of decay in terms of violent crime in the last 10 or 12 years has been really startling and totally different than it was a generation ago.
It is. And Newt, one thing that's worth noting, I think, too, is one of the things I think that's really incredible about Trump 47 presidency right now is all of these assumptions that people made about intractable problems that couldn't be solved in many ways are being solved. Think of the border. Joe Biden sort of threw his hands up and Congress was debating this idea of adding more laws, which was a Democrat Trojan horse that I objected to. I just said you needed a new president, and that's what we got, a new president. Now we have all-time low border crossings. We're meeting mass migration with mass deportations, which is a good thing. And then you look and see what's happening in Washington, D.C. I mean, carjackings over a 2-week period are down 85%. Robberies are down 50%. So we shouldn't just accept that these problems are too big to solve. We just need the willingness and the political will to go do it. And I think President Trump's leading the way on that.
I was surprised, given that I'd always known you when you were Attorney General. I didn't realize that you didn't grow up around lawyers. What drew you to the law in the first place?
Yeah, I grew up in a working class neighborhood. My dad worked 7 days a week in the midnight shift. My grandfather operated a forklift. My other grandfather was a butcher. For me, I saw law as giving structure for people to pursue their dreams, whatever that was. And it kind of coincided then my entry into politics was with my son having some medical challenges, spurred me to action. But I also, when I was growing up, I watched Crossfire with my dad at night. We went to my ball games. We watched Crossfire, watched Jack Kemp. I'd watched Pat Buchanan. I was in college during the 1994 revolution that you led. I mean, those were formative things for me. Running for office wasn't necessarily something I was really considering. I was practicing law and I was attracted to the structure of it and what it meant for our republic and the fact that in courtrooms, the facts are supposed to matter. I was attracted to it. So I went to the first person to go to college out of high school in my family and then certainly first person to go to law school. So to then serve as the Attorney General was just a big honor for me. It was just kind of unimaginable where I grew up that somebody like me would be in that spot. So I just tried to make the most of it. And the rule of law, I think, is just central to this American experiment.
I think you cannot have freedom without the rule of law. It's not possible. And I think it's something we don't drive home often enough, that in the end, each of us individually is protected by the Constitution and the laws that grow out of it. And in fact, it is precisely the weak who are the most in danger if the rule of law breaks down, which is why I've always been astonished that liberals who claim to be for the poor don't understand that it is precisely the poor who most need the rule of law, because they're the ones most likely to be exploited in a lawless environment.
That was my family's experience in the sense that I didn't know any lawyers growing up. There was nobody to call that could help. I viewed it as a way of being able to fight for the little guy in many ways, and it's one of the things that attracted me. But also, as you point out, the rule of law is so important. It's why when I was Attorney General and Biden came in, what was so astonishing about what was happening and why I wrote the book, Last Line of Defense, How to Beat the Left in Court, people can get on Amazon, just got hit with the designation of New York Times bestseller, which, as you know, Newt, for a conservative is a big deal. But I think the point of it is I saw what it was like, and it's kind of a field manual of what it was like to be on the front lines against this left-wing lawfare machine that came at us from so many different angles. It was the election of 2020. We beat Mark Elias 3 times in Missouri. He was successful in other states to weaken their election laws. It was the COVID restrictions that seemingly went on forever and ever. We sued 50 school districts to get them to back off mask mandates. We took on the student loan debt forgiveness scam that would have stuck taxpayers with $500 billion. We took that to the Supreme Court. We won. We took the vaccine mandate cases all the way to the Supreme Court and we won. And perhaps most famously, we filed the Missouri versus Biden lawsuit, which before Elon Musk bought Twitter, before congressional hearings, really exposed the censorship enterprise that the Biden administration was working with big tech companies when that was just called a conspiracy theory. So we took on DEI, we took on CRT, we took on the Net Zero Banking Alliance, all that in a couple years. I'm really proud of that work. And I think the book gives the reader, your audience, it's not written for lawyers. I hope lawyers read it, but it's really, what was it like to see all this happening? And what was it like to take Anthony Fauci's deposition in that Missouri versus Biden case? What was it like to take Elvis Chan's deposition, the FBI agent who was pre-bunking the Hunter Biden laptop story on the way to 2020? All that's in the book. And more importantly than just war stories, it is a playbook of what we need to do when we see this stuff happening sometime soon. Hopefully farther away, but it'll happen again.
I think part of your natural aggressiveness came out of your background in sports. You were very active in playing in sports.
It's right. I had not written a book before, Newt. You know, when you do, you reflect on what were the experiences that forged you in this moment, your willingness to stand up and fight. And the title of the book is Last Line of Defense. I realized I played a lot of sports growing up, including in college. I realized that in every sport that I played, in basketball, I'm 6'6" too, which probably explains some of this. But in basketball, I played in the paint. In baseball, I played in the outfield, and in football, I played free safety, which in every sport was like the last line of defense. I mean, you're the last barrier. So I suppose I've always kind of, whether by nature or nurture, embraced the role of being a defender of the things that we hold dear. And I love this country, our framework. I love our people. I love America. What I saw happening from the Biden administration, the left had taken over that White House. People who were just probably a year earlier with a gender studies degree from Harvard writing white papers about open borders were suddenly in charge of opening up our border. And you saw corporations fall in line here too. You know, in your hometown of Atlanta and Coca-Cola, they were having struggle sessions where employees had to explain how they were going to be less white. And then you had 5-year-olds being forced to wear masks all day long, even though there was no science to support it. It was just a wild, crazy time defined by a pandemic and social unrest. And I think the most aggressively liberal administration we've seen in American history.
No, I think that's right. I think they basically were Obama's third term, and they brought all of his most radical appointees forward to be the Biden administration. It's a big reason why Trump ended up winning, because the country was increasingly turned off by how radical and how aggressive.
I start the book, Last Line of Defense, How to Beat the Left in Court, People Can Get Now. In November of 2024, the fever broke. I really believe, really kind of look back on the fever dream that we were living through. And, you know, it was a time of these lockdowns and mandates and censorship, not somewhere else, but in our country. And I've said before, I don't think power necessarily corrupts, but I do think power reveals. And I think COVID in particular was a test run. It revealed the true nature of the left and what they would do if they could actually consolidate power and weaponize it in ways we've not seen before. Take that apart from even the lawfare against President Trump that they were willing to employ because they labeled him a quote unquote threat to democracy when they were bulldozing democracy and the republic along the way. It's just very revealing. And I think you're right. The American people sat in their own jury box and they saw all this stuff happening and they rendered their verdict. Thank God.
Biden was so bad, and the Democrats he represents were so bad, that he actually created an environment for Trump to be even bolder and, if you will, more radical in his reforms than he was in the first term, because now he's operating against a backdrop of things that are horrible. This is not the America they wanted.
I agree. And I also think, and I've told President Trump, I play well enough to get invited back to play golf with President Trump. I don't really disclose private conversations with him, but I did tell him one time that, you know, it's almost the non-consecutive term for him is in some ways, I think it's divinely inspired, because not only did you see the excesses of the Biden term, But he also was able to put together a team now and a strategy. It would have been different if it would have been the consecutive term. By the way, his incentive structure is different now, too. He's got this 4-year window here to do all of the things that as conservatives we've thought about doing, but not a lot of people have had the guts to go do. I also think that's one of his great legacies to our party, is he's inspired people to be fearless. And the left, that's never been their problem. They want to upend things and they don't apologize for it. But just look at this redistricting battle that's going to unfold across the country. That would have been unthinkable for Republicans to engage in that. I hope we do, because the Democrats have done it. They've already done it. Well, you just ought to play by the same rules. And again, the reason why I wrote the book, The Last Line of Defense, was in the legal world, I think conservatives ceded the courts too easily in the past. We've got to be willing to fight on all fronts, and that means in the Article 3 branch in the courts too.
I have to go back just for a minute to your athletic background. If you were 6'6" and you were free safety, you must be very fast.
A long time ago, Newt. In fact, I probably should have been a tight end, but I couldn't put on the weight when I was 18, 19 years old. That came later, a little later in life. I had some wheels back then, but that's a long time ago. The only time I get to do anything now, Newt, is in the congressional baseball game.
I guess I never thought about it, but I guess if you were a free safety who's 6'6", you also, just by putting your arms out, cover a lot more of the field than a smaller guy does.
Well, I was a bit of a ball hawk. So I had a lot of fun, but also, growing up where I grew up too, I'm not afraid of confrontation either. I think that if you care about the things that you believe in, as you know, you got to be in the arena. And when you do that, you realize that when you get on the other side of it, there's a lot of things you can be proud of. And what people, I think, are dying for more than anything right now is authentic leadership. And you just be yourself. And for me, I've always been a fighter in that way. And I do think it's interesting now as the Democrats sort of fall all over themselves to position themselves. This sort of fake tough guy thing that they're all trying to pull off is just fake authenticity. Like they just discovered cuss words. It's just so ridiculous.
I thought Tim Walz trying to use a shotgun was probably as good an example, or for that matter, back in 2004, watching John Kerry try to go goose hunting in an outfit that he clearly had bought that morning.
Hey, you wonder why they have a problem with young men right now. That would explain some of it. And I also think, by the way, what they did during COVID to young people, that is also, as you and I both know, I'm Gen X, even though it's gotten way more conservative as people get older, which is typically the trajectory. The current 18 to 24-year-old population is more conservative than any generation before them. So I think that bodes well for us, too, if we can keep this coalition together.
In terms of coalitions, let me go back for a minute. You run for the Senate, Missouri Senate, in 2008. What led you to decide to get into elected office?
I was in my early 30s. I had just made partner and things were great. And we were starting a family and my son, Stephen, was born. And we found out just 5 months in that he was born with a rare genetic condition. In fact, we took him to the hospital, the dermatologist, because he had sort of an angel wing birthmark on his leg. And we thought so little of the doctor's appointment. I joke that my wife let me take Stephen to the dermatologist that day. So I take him and they put him under a black light, and the dermatologist said he probably has something called tuberous sclerosis. We'll run some more tests. And I was like, what is that? Turns out it's a genetic condition where tumors form in different organs, including Stephen's brain. So it's severely affected his development. He just turned 21 last week. He's nonverbal. He's on the autism spectrum, but he is epilepsy, which is the most medically challenging part of the diagnosis. So he has seizures almost every day. But when he was really young, we were just getting accustomed to this diagnosis. He would have seizures that would last a long time, including a 4-hour seizure, Newt. I was holding his hand on the hospital bed. They were trying these medications to try to get it to stop. Nothing would work. Finally, the last one did. We almost lost Stephen. We were in the ICU for over a week. And I went through this kind of discernment, this reflection on what do I want to do with my life? That was something as a first-time father who was, in my early 30s. It kind of spurred me into want to do more. And so for me, it was running for office to try to make a difference. That's how I decided to do it after a lot of prayer. And Stephen's always been that inspiration to go do it. He still is, and to fight for things. And I think there's probably something to that where I know that Stephen isn't going to have those same opportunities. He has no words. I think it propels me to make the most of it. So that's why I ran for the state Senate, was able to do some things there in Missouri. Autism insurance reform, tax cuts, taking on government overreach, did that, and then was in statewide office as Attorney General. And then when Roy Blunt announced he wasn't going to seek another term, jumped into that race and was successful. But Stephen, it was the catalytic event for all of this, and still to this day, kind of my touchstone.
It must have been very frightening to see a young child have those kind of seizures.
Yeah, and Stephen still does, Newt. We haven't had a 4-hour one in a while. He still will have grand mal seizures. You feel very powerless because there's nothing you can really do about it except pray and be there for him. So he's very loved, but it's taught me a lot. It's taught me a lot about what's really important, what really matters in this life, and that, and strengthen my faith. I know that sometimes that sounds strange to people, but I think that God has given us Stephen to protect him. I talk about that in the book a little bit too. That protector instinct, I guess, I had in sports. And I remember specifically when I was in 7th grade, there were some bullies picking on a kid who had special needs. And for whatever reason, I was spurred to defend him. Didn't really know the kid that well, but felt like that was unfair. And eventually shamed these guys with my words, but was prepared to go further than that. But I remember going home, and my dad was a great guy and still living, and just said, yeah, you don't ever let anybody take advantage of somebody in that kind of position. And that stuck with me. Little did I know then I'd be a father, right, of a son with those kind of issues, well, more profound issues than that. So I think God sent Stephen our way for a bunch of reasons, and he's taught me a lot. And I think anybody that's ever met him made him a better person.
You've responded to the challenge in a remarkably caring and compassionate way, which I think is a wonderful model for the rest of us.
Well, thank you.
You go to the state Senate, you serve 8 years. What led you to run for Attorney General?
Well, actually, there was a stint where Missouri was changing over. It had, as you know, as a student of politics, Missouri had been this ultimate bellwether and was a purple state. I mean, Harry Truman was from Missouri, right? Was run by Democrats for a very long time. Republicans would break through every once in a while. It was always a very conservative state, but Republicans really didn't break through. They did in the legislature in the early 2000s, like a lot of places, but in statewide offices, not so much. In 2016, for example, every statewide office holder was a Democrat except for one. And that was the year that we kind of broke through. Josh Hawley was actually Attorney General before me, and I was elected treasurer, and we kind of swept through. Hawley then goes to the Senate. I was appointed then to fill his remaining 2 years of his term, ran for Attorney General and won in 2020, and then the Senate was in 2022. So I served as Attorney General for 4 years, but Josh Hawley was the immediate predecessor, and then Andrew Bailey followed me up. So we've had a good run of AGs in Missouri. I think Missouri in particular, Newt, you'll appreciate this. I think people want to understand, somebody asked me one time, is it a northern state? Is it a southern state? Is it a Midwestern state? Is it a Western state? And my answer is yes. It's kind of all those things. It's a cultural crossroads. But one thing that ties all those regions together is it's always been very suspicious of a federal government 1,000 miles away telling us how to run our lives. And so I think when I was AG and we saw that happening in Washington, which I relay in the book, Last Line of Defense, it was our time to stand up and fight for not just Missourians, but for the rest of the country on some big wins.
You happen to be in a unique position because you had 2 years with Trump where you could focus on crime, and then boom, you suddenly have this very aggressive left-wing radicalism of the Biden administration. In terms of your own thinking and your own team's operation, how long did it take you to shift gears and realize that you were in a different world?
Well, we had a special litigation unit, sort of think of it as a SEAL team that you have in an AG's office. I wanted to have, when I came in, even the first 2 years, I wanted to have the model AG office in the country. And we looked and saw what were the things that we could do. So we wanted to push back against federal overreach. At the state level, we weren't deferring. Think about Chevron deference. We weren't deferring, even though we were defending agencies. We never argued to the court that they were the experts. We wanted the judges to rule on the law as it was written, not how they want it to be or what some expert said it should be. And then at the local level, we would go after local governments that exceeded their authority. Think of mass mandates, think of those sorts of things. But I was fortunate. We had a great team. I mean, my Solicitor General, and for your audience, that's the person that typically will argue the cases at the Missouri Supreme Court or the United States Supreme Court, was a guy by the name of John Sauer, who I recommended to President Trump. And John Sauer is now the Solicitor General of the United States of America. So we had a great team. John Sauer led that group. I had a great chief of staff, Justin Smith. And what happened, Newt, and you appreciate this, when you exhibit that kind of leadership, we started having people from all across the country apply to work in our office because they saw the work that we were doing. And when you look at the landscape, the country's divided into different judicial circuits. Missouri is the biggest state in the 8th Circuit, which is typically pretty conservative appellate court in the 8th Circuit. And then you kind of had a mix in the district court level. Now, the first 4 district court judges appointed by President Trump are in St. Louis. They all worked for me in the Attorney General's office. So you're starting to see then, one of the things I'm most proud of, that courage was contagious. And it's playing itself out now in senior positions at the Department of Justice and courts and other places that I think we can be really proud of. And again, that's part of the playbook here in the book. The last line of defense is conservatives shouldn't cede any ground. We should fight, and you'll forge a lot of character in doing it. But we saw pretty early that they were going to be very aggressive with their executive orders, and we were ready. And we had a legal team, and then, other states would join, or we would join with other states, but we tried to take the lead as much as we could. And I think, though, that once we got into the vaccine mandate cases, once we got into the censorship case, we were drawing a lot of attention because we were doing good work. We were taking on the tough fights and we were winning. It kind of became a model.
You really did a tremendous job. And the first really big multi-state case on the social cost of carbon rule, for those of us who are not expert, can you explain why did this matter so much?
So this social cost of greenhouse gases rule was the most important rule no one had ever heard of. What they were trying to do, this is like the Green New Deal without anybody ever having to vote on it. Because what they would do was they would extrapolate into hundreds of years into the future, taking into account historical events that they would predict. What would the impact of you building something be? What would be the carbon impact of that years down the road? It's all speculation. But what it was meant to do was to give unelected bureaucrats the ability to say no to things that should have been allowed to be constructed or built by law. Of course, you would have the right to build this highway connecting point A and point B, but they would come up with some ridiculous excuse justified by this rule to say no to you. So that was just like the first instance. Then, of course, they tried to undo all of the executive orders that President Trump had on the border, like remain in Mexico, Title 42, building the wall. We fought those and won for a while. Ultimately, though, Biden was able to reverse the executive orders from the previous administration, but we held the dam back for a while, and probably millions of people didn't come in for the times in which we had injunctions in place. But it was an all-out assault. I mean, that's what you kind of saw was whether it was the border, on the environmental stuff, on the just sort of personal freedom side of it. Think about this. Congress passes the CHIPS Act so you can build more chips in the United States, high-end chips. They were holding up a project in Arizona to do this because they hadn't hired enough ex-convicts to meet DEI requirements that Congress never voted on. Broadband, there was money for broadband to connect rural America to the internet. And those projects were being held up because there weren't climate action plans submitted by small contractors. I mean, this is kind of just the leviathan that can exist in government that really restricts not just people's individual liberty, but progress, construction, us being, a dominant player for pharmaceuticals that we need to bring back home, or the industrial base, the reshoring of manufacturing. If you have a government that's weaponized really against all of that stuff, it's really hard to do. So our job was to try to fight back against those things when we saw them.
It was very impressive, the number of different lawsuits you filed in that short period of time before running for the Senate. How did you pick which ones to file? Biden and his team were giving you so many opportunities. How did you single out and pick the ones you really wanted to focus on?
Nationally, we were viewed, the Republican Attorneys General Association is a great organization. I was vice chair for a while, briefly chair until I had to step down to run for the Senate. It was a good group. Everybody had really good relationships, and some people would just kind of take the lead. And some offices had more horsepower than others just because of size or focus. And we ended up just saying, hey, we've got something drafted. Who wants to join? And some was just initiative, But, it's interesting how some of these cases that come along, like I mentioned in the book, Last Line of Defense, How to Beat the Left in Court, people can get it on Amazon right now, is like, do people ask me, why did you decide to file this censorship lawsuit, the Missouri versus Biden? Well, I'm there with my team. We're watching Jen Psaki at the podium talk about openly, like, hey, we're flagging this stuff for Facebook on COVID misinformation or something. And then they floated this idea of a disinformation governance board, where the government would be deciding what the truth is and what you could say. And it just struck me, knowing how I know things work, that if they were willing to say that out loud publicly, there was a lot more beneath the surface. And so we filed a lawsuit in May of 2022 alleging that the Biden administration was colluding, coordinating, and coercing social media companies to do their bidding and censor speech. When we filed it, of course, everyone lampooned it as a conspiracy theory, and it was for attention-grabbing purposes and all this. But we made a strategic decision. I think this is why the book will be interesting to people who aren't lawyers, and it's not really written for lawyers. Like I said, I hope lawyers read it, but it's really for, your audience, like normal people who are like wanting to see what was going on at the time. Normally in those kind of lawsuits, Newt, you seek an injunction, which is right away, which is a temporary restraining order to get the government or some party to stop doing what they're doing that you find objectionable. What we decided to do, because we knew we were going to need evidence, we asked the judge for discovery first, and he granted it. And the moment that all of this kind of came home to me as just truly shocking was when we got the reams and reams and thousands of pages of emails and text messages from high-ranking government officials to senior members of leadership teams on social media saying, take this down. The CDC was giving them words and phrases to censor. They censored RFK Jr. day 3 of the administration because of his encouraging vaccine hesitancy or whatever the issue was. It was just shocking how aggressive they were. We all know government can't censor your speech, but you can't outsource it either. Then they were working with these NGOs, Newt, with Stanford and University of Washington, to have them flag this stuff too for social media companies. And by the way, this enterprise really kind of predated Biden even coming in office. That's one of the things that's most shocking. The FBI, we took the deposition of Elvis Chan, who was pre-bunking the Hunter Biden laptop story in 2020. And the FBI had it in 2019. They knew it was real, yet they were telling social media companies, look out for this Russian hack and leak operation. Well, it turns out as early as 2017, they were working with Democrat staffers, facilitating meetings with social media companies to flag certain speech to take down about the border or things they found objectionable. And one of the crazy things is start connecting all the dots here. The general counsel at the FBI during the end of 2016, when you start this Russiagate nonsense, was a guy by the name of James Baker. He then, during the Hunter Biden laptop censorship effort in 2020, is the general counsel of Twitter. So these guys, they were in some instances working hand in glove. In other instances, the Biden administration was threatening investigations. Section 230 protections would go away if they didn't do what they wanted them to do. It's chilling. That kind of censorship regime in the United States of America, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, like that is not something we should accept in this country. And it was happening, and we exposed it in the Missouri versus Biden lawsuit that we talk about in the book.
When you were clearly making a historic impact as Attorney General, then you run for the U.S. Senate. President Trump endorses you. You win decisively. And when Trump himself announces, you're one of the very first senators to endorse him. Why did you move so early?
I think President Trump, I've gotten to know him really well as you spend time with him. He loves America. He's authentic. People see it. And he connects with real people. And I think where we're at right now in this country is we need that more than ever. I also think the level of disruption that he brings to permanent Washington, we need more of it. So for me, it was a no-brainer. And I did everything that I could. I spent a lot of time on the campaign trail with him, did whatever I could to open up before he came in with the rallies and the closing days of the campaign. He has also brought a great realignment of our party to fight for working people. That's where I grew up. I think working folks need a champion for them, and the Democrats have completely abandoned that space. The Democrats that I grew up around were pro-life or pro-gun. Those people don't hold elected office anymore. So President Trump spoke, I think, to people. And by the way, the people that get hit with this double whammy, Newt, of their jobs were shipped overseas for lower wages. And then as they're looking for new careers and new jobs through illegal immigration, their wages were being undercut in that way too. And they needed somebody to fight for them. President Trump's been that person. And so, yeah, I was very early. And I also thought that what I saw in a place like Missouri was people still very much wanted him back in office. I just never thought anybody was ever going to have a chance against the guy. I believed in him and still do. And so to now be somebody that gets to spend time with him or fight for his agenda. I actually got to, as a freshman senator, got to handle the rescissions package in the Senate that we got done. It's harder than it should have been, but we were able to get that done and defund NPR, which has been talked about for a long time, to be able to get rid of all the USAID wasteful spending. That was certainly a proud moment and why I wanted to be in the Senate fighting alongside President Trump.
I think you have already, in a relatively short career, had an enormous impact both as Attorney General and now as senator. And I think your new book, The Last Line of Defense, How to Beat the Left in Court, is going to become a basic study book for every conservative who wants to better understand how we can use the courts at least as well as the left can, and that we should not be shy about it or hide from it, but be very willing to go in and fight. And I want to thank you for joining me. You now have a New York Times bestseller. It's available on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And I want to let our listeners know they can find out more about all the different things you're doing in the U.S. Senate by visiting your website at schmitt.senate.gov.
Thanks, Newt. Thank you.
Thank you to my guest, Senator Eric Schmitt. You can get a link to buy his new book, The Last Line of Defense, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. And our guest producer is Lily Haley. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.